Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Mighty God, we ask your blessing on our Bible study today as we approach the Feast of Pentecost this Sunday. May the Holy Spirit be with us and fill us and inspire us in new ways. All this we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
All right, we are going to start with this video and then jump into chapters 17 and 18 and hopefully 19 and see where that goes. You see the black screen with the YouTube stuff at the bottom? Okay. All right. I'm going to press play and then hide my video after that.
Well, Harry, we are moving now into the next few chapters, 17 to 20, and we start off with the famous story of the Transfiguration, and then move into some of Jesus' advice for his disciples. Do you want to set the scene for us? What's going on here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jesus is still teaching in Galilee when we start this part of the gospel, but at the end he moves toward Jerusalem, and so we're gradually getting closer and closer to the climactic scenes of the end, and the tension builds up as we move along, and the expectations of what it means to be a disciple are ratcheted up, I think, as this process moves along. But we begin with this extraordinary moment in chapter 17, which is picked up from the Markan story of the Transfiguration, where something that Matthew has been hinting at all along becomes apparent to the disciples, that Jesus is a really very special kind of person. He's transfigured before them, and his heavenly character is somehow displayed. Exactly how Matthew understood that heavenly character of Jesus is a little unclear, but that he is a heavenly character is clear. We had seen a hint of that back in chapter 11, where the saying about Jesus and the Father, the Father who revealed to Jesus all that he wanted revealed, etc., and the bidding to come and find rest in him. Jesus appears as a kind of heavenly figure there in the way that he speaks. And here that heavenly dimension, I think, is portrayed narratively. So this kind of sets the stage for what will be an increasingly gritty and earthly story of Jesus engaged with the powers that be on earth. And so I think it's in part setting that stage in a very dramatic way.
Yeah, interesting. So that contrast between the heavenly and the earthly.
Right.
Yeah. So moving into the advice in chapter 18, some of it's fairly radical, right? He says, cut your arm off, gouge your eye out. Are we to take this literally, Harry?
Well, there's the specific advice about what you're to do in cases of temptation. But I like to frame this in terms of what's going on with this little discourse overall. This is the fourth of the big discourse sections in Matthew, and in some ways it's the least of the lot, right? It's not as extensive as some of the others. But it does have a couple of clear thematic foci, and I think those are worth keeping in mind. One is, as it begins, and you can perhaps comment on this in a bit, become like little children. I know you have little children at home, and that would be interesting to hear. So he's talking to his disciples as children, inviting them to accept the message, accept their status of disciples in the way I think that a trusting child would. I think that's an important part of it. And then also a warning. Matthew always has the warnings going on here, right? So if you scandalize one of these children, then it would be better to have a great millstone fastened around your neck and drowned, right? Woe to the world because of stumbling blocks. An important bit of advice in this day and age where we've seen too many scandals with children in churches, especially my own. So this leads into the advice that you were talking about in chapter 18, verses 8 and following. If your hand or foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. This is another example, I think, of what we've spoken about before, the hyperbolic statements of Jesus that really challenge you to challenge any hearer to think about where your values truly lie. I don't think Jesus meant this literally. The tradition certainly has not taken it as such, but it has taken it as a serious warning about that very issue. That is, where does your heart beat most strongly? and uproot from yourself those things that are not conducive to life and life in abundance, the kind of abundance we saw in the feeding stories. But the rest of this, Matthew always has words of consolation and hope balanced with his words of judgment. And I think the rest of this is in some ways more on the hopeful side, and it's about reconciliation. And so one of the things to take away from this discourse is a little bit of reflection on what was going on in Matthew's church, which is probably not unlike things that have gone on in most churches throughout time. That is, people don't always get together in the best way all the time. And I think Matthew was saying, I know, folks, that that's the case, but it's your responsibility. His emphasis on responsibility and getting the deed done. It's your responsibility to see that that happens, and do so in light of the fact that God is forgiving. And then Peter, of course, asked, well, how often do we do that? You know, there has to be limits, aren't there?
How many times do you do that? Yeah.
There have to be limits on this, Jesus. And Jesus cites this, fantastic number, 70 times 7, which is a number for as many as you can imagine.
Yeah.
So, the discourse here has these provocative elements that I think go back to Jesus himself, and the elements of reconciliation within this community of people who are trying to live by the highest ideals. It's a recognition that quest for perfection that Jesus laid on the table in the Sermon on the Mount is not an easy one.
Right. And I think one of the sort of vivid pictures of this idea of reconciliation that you're drawing out occurs in the parable of the lost sheep, such a famous story. And that parable shows up in Luke as well. Are they using it in the same way? How would you compare the two?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. We know that Jesus uses a lot of agricultural and shepherding images in various places, and those are rooted in the Old Testament as well. So he probably certainly told some sort of story like this. Luke spins it in a different way, and Luke spins it in connection with his concern for forgiveness. And what happens at the end of Luke's story is that there's great rejoicing when the lost sheep is found, as there is rejoicing in heaven when the sinner repents. Here, this is in part of Matthew's warning. It's a warning to leaders in the church that they have a responsibility for the least of their brethren, right? And so it's directed at the shepherds more than at the reaction on the part of the sheep being found. It's saying, shepherds, you look out for those folk who might be going the wrong way.
Yeah. Do you hear, again, that Ezekiel 34 sort of anxiety about the shepherds?
Yeah. Another case of Matthew alluding to and picking up on some important Old Testament themes without the device of an explicit prophetic quotation, which we've also seen him use.
Right, exactly. Another parable in this section is the parable of the unforgiving servant, or the unmerciful servant. What do you make of that? It ties in with this theme of forgiveness that you've mentioned Luke really highlights, but in some ways that are sort of counterintuitive. Help us understand what's happening here.
Well, there are a couple of reward stories and master servant stories that Matthew is using here. And I think that all of them in some way serve as part of the theme that seems to be guiding the composition of this part of the gospel, that there is a cost to discipleship. The figure of the unforgiving servant is in part too about responsibility, about the necessity for action within the framework of an environment where forgiveness and reconciliation is being fostered by a loving God, right? So I think that's part of it all. But the servant who does not act as his master has suggested he should be acting, and as he's given an example of acting, puts the responsibility on the slave. And that's the important message that I think Matthew was trying to get across at this point.
Is it realistic at that time for slaves to be handling large sums of money, or is this just part of the story?
Actually, it sounds to us as a little bit unrealistic, right? We have an image of chattel slavery where slaves were field hands and totally oppressed and everything else. It wasn't pleasant to be a slave generally in antiquity, that's for sure. But slaves had different social roles in antiquity, and some of them could, in fact, be major managers of estates or imperial offices or who knows what. It's not quite as counterintuitive as we might gather from our own experiences of slavery.
Right, right. And some slaves could have been well educated as well,
Indeed.
right? So
yeah, we certainly see this in the Roman imperial house, and we've seen before how Matthew is interested in contemporary structures of authority and wants to critique them in some way or other. But there were a lot of people who were servants of the emperor, who were probably as wealthy as anybody else in the Roman Empire. Their status was slave. Their economic resources were enormous.
Yes, yes, right. Well, speaking of structures of authority, we also have the parable in chapter 20 about the laborers, and the master and the laborers and their pay. What's going on with this story?
God
seems a little bit unfair in this.
Doesn't
If God
he,
is the
though?
master, right?
Right. If God is the master, and that's one of the things about Matthew's version of the parables, the main figure in them is usually taken to be an image of God. And we've said before that there's a kind of shaping of parable interpretation in Matthew, and that's one important part of it. It reflects, by the way, some of the things that go on in rabbinic parables, where very often a king of flesh and blood is a symbol for God. So the main actor in Matthean parables is often a cipher for divinity. Not necessarily so in the way Jesus told the stories to begin with, but certainly here. So the parable of the landowner who has laborers who come in during the course of the day, and the people who come in at 8 o'clock in the morning get the same pay as the people who come in at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, which just doesn't seem fair, does it?
No.
But some people have pointed out this is probably simply a reaction to market structures. There are fewer laborers around later in the afternoon. You have to
He
pay them
has
more.
to, yep.
Yes. I don't think Jesus was trying to give us a lesson in economics. I think both for Jesus and certainly for Matthew, what you have here is an image of graciousness. And people are called to respond in a similar way. But it could be, an issue of the cost of discipleship. And it could be a parable that speaks to the human experience that I think so many of us have had of people saying, well, life just isn't fair. Someone else is getting more than I'm getting. In some ways, Jesus says, if you're going to be a member of this operation, that's going to happen from time to time. Get
Right.
used to it.
Right. Yeah, the life isn't fair brings me back to what you mentioned in the beginning about my young kids. I hear that quite a bit. But I, at the same time, I think that, Jesus' point about having faith like little children is very evident to me as the mother of little children, that they just soak in the world and have this wonder and this faith that is just innate and amazing to see. There's one more thing I've thought about here, Harry, that I'd love to hear your opinion on. So we've talked about Jesus' comment about cutting off your hand, right, in chapter 18. But then in chapter 19, he says this really interesting thing about eunuchs. He says, not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For some are eunuchs because they were born that way. Others were made that way by men, and others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. Is there a connection between those sayings, and what do you make of this eunuch bit?
Yeah, this is unique to Matthew,
Yeah.
this particular saying. And it's in response to a question in chapter 19, verse 10. If such is the case of a man with his wife, is it better not to marry? So it reminds me of the situation in 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul is talking about marriage and the like. We've already referred to it in connection with the divorce saying, which is also part of this context. And certainly it was the case in some early Christian circles that people thought that it was better not to marry. Paul is addressing that very belief in 1 Corinthians. And we know it becomes important later on as ascetical practice develops in Christianity. And this is often taken to be a text that supports voluntary celibacy in the church, and it probably had a similar kind of function. I think Jesus said something like this. It's not the sort of saying you make up,
Right.
right? Praising eunuchs. And it's, again, part of the the phenomenon we've seen before, where Jesus calls into question contemporary family structures. He's, he says that might not be where your commitment ought to be. So I can well imagine Jesus saying this and saying it within the context of an expectation that the kingdom is coming soon, and we ought to be totally devoted to that. But again, probably not encouraging people to go and actually become physically eunuchs. Yeah.
Okay, so we've seen Jesus giving advice to his disciples, and we've seen how some of those sayings are hard. They're difficult sayings. And you mentioned before that this section is ratcheting up the tension and leading us to the controversy that will happen in the climax of the story. That's where we're headed next. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Onward to Matthew. Any thoughts on that before we move on? They were obviously a little ahead of us. They started at 17 and continued into 20. So we'll see how far we can get today. But any thoughts before we move in? All right. Okay. Alban, can you read the beginning at 14? So just as a reminder, we read the Transfiguration, which this gospel calls the Transformation, and we are moving through 17. Can you read this section? And
can you make it a little bigger?
I can, yes. I can probably make it even bigger than that. Let's see. Trying. How's that?
Oh, that's good.
All right, so read through verse 23 to all the way to heartbroken.
Okay. So when they came to the crowd, a man met Jesus. He knelt before him, saying, "Lord, show mercy to my son. He is epileptic and suffers terribly, for he often falls into the fire or the water. I brought him to your disciples, but they couldn't heal him." Jesus answered, "You faithless and crooked generation, how long will I be with you? How long will I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me." Then Jesus spoke harshly to the demon, and it came out of the child, who was healed from that time on. Then the disciples came to Jesus in private and said, "Why couldn't we throw the demon out?" "Because you have little faith," he said. "I assure you that if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, 'Go from here to there,' and it will go. There will be nothing that you can't do." When the disciples came together in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The human one is about to be delivered over into human hands. They will kill him, but he would be raised on the third day." And they were heartbroken.
Great. Okay, so this section, this is the beginning of a longer section that follows the Transfiguration, and will transition into teaching. Our professors from Yale noted that and talked about some of the parables and other teachings that we're going to get beginning actually at the end of this chapter. But I think there's a couple of things you could say about these two passages, but among them are that they do function following the Transfiguration as kind of a bridge and transition into highlighting the difference of who Jesus is, and the sort of vast gap, at least at the time, between him and his disciples, right? Like, his disciples can't do some of the things that he can do. He was just up on the mountain transfigured, talking to Moses and Elijah. They didn't really understand exactly what was going on. Now they come down, and we haven't gotten that much detail at the conversations around the different healing narratives that we've read thus far. And in this one, I think this is a first where we discover that the disciples have been trying to be like Jesus and are failing at it, right? So that's one way of thinking about this. I don't have a good answer for you faithless and crooked generation. How long will I be with you? How long will I put up with you? Bring the boy to me. If I was adding an edit, I might say then Jesus spoke more harshly to the demon, because he doesn't seem to speak all that nicely to the people that are there who are faithless and crooked. But I do think it illustrates the gap between Jesus and his closeness to God, the Son of God, he is God, and that everybody else is not there. And so you do have a question about, Jesus can do something they can't, and then they wonder why this is possible, that he can do it and they can't. And he basically says it's because they're just not there yet. They don't have any faith, and they need to have more faith, and they will be able to do things once they have more faith. The second part of this is our second passion prediction. And again, the Son of Man here is about to be delivered into human hands. They will kill him, but he will be raised on the third day. And again, I think it illustrates that they're not in the same place as he is. They have not yet come to accept really who Jesus is and what his ministry fully is. So not only can they not do what he's doing in terms of healings and their faith, but their faith in him is still not completely there. So anything on this before we move on? Any questions or? All right. JD, can you read the last section, paying the temple tax?
Sure. When they came to Capernaum, the people who collected the half shekel temple tax came to Peter and said, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" "Yes," he said. But when they came into the house, Jesus spoke to Peter first. "What do you think, Simon? From whom do earthly kings collect taxes? From their children or from strangers?" "From strangers," he said. Jesus said to him, "Then the children don't have to pay. But just as we don't offend them, go to the lake, throw out a fishing line and hook, and take the first fish you catch. When you open its mouth, you will find a shekel coin. Take it and pay the tax for both of us."
Great. Okay. My view on this is a mix of, we're still talking about the relationship between Jesus and his disciples, but the transition here is now, how do they interact with the world? And if they're going to be like Jesus, they must be different from the world. We'll see more of that in a second, right? Where the world does certain things, but they live in the world. And so they still have to abide to a certain degree, at least, by the basic customs and rules of the way things are going. And so, yes, pay the tax, but it's not because of any, love of the of a tax or this or that. And in fact, there's a critique right in the middle of it about taxes in general, right? That some people have to pay more taxes than others, or some people pay taxes and some people don't. But they are still required, and so not defend, they still pay the tax. And there's a miraculous way of doing that, which I've always liked. Personally, I would love it if my taxes could be paid like this. I would love to go over to the Sound and get a check out of the fish, and I think probably all of us would. But any comments on this? Again, the location is noteworthy. We're back in Capernaum, so we're still in that northern Galilee, Sea of Galilee region.
Yeah. So is he, I guess to me, is he saying, Jesus saying, like they're the Jesus and Peter and the disciples, that they're the children of God. So they don't have to pay, since who pays? The children of the strangers. So if we're the children, he's saying then the children don't have to pay. So, but let's not offend them. Isn't he saying we don't pay, but let's not make it look bad? We'll throw the shekel for the two of us that you're gonna find in the lake?
I think it could be that. I think it also could be very quite literal that like sort of a sideways swipe at, I mean, the question, right, comes the people who collected the half shekel temple tax, right?
Right.
And this is presumably, the question is does your teacher pay the temple tax, which presumably is different from a Roman tax, right? And so this could be a swipe at the religious establishment where they don't have to pay, right? And in fact, they get if you know some of the background on it, they may have gotten the benefits of it in terms of some of the sacrifices and what have you. So it could be a swipe at them as well, that their families don't have to pay this, even though he says from earthly kings, right? So there is on earth a division, and you could make the jump, I think, that we're the children of God, or because
Right.
and we don't have to pay. But I think that there is some, and we'll get more of this as we get into some of these other parables. I think there is a general unfairness that may be looked at in this as well. That shouldn't everybody be taking part in this if some have to, as opposed to some people that are special get off the hook.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, it's. I think that in Matthew, in particular, the context does matter. And so, and we'll see this in the next chapter as well, and the following chapter, that the overall theme, I believe, of this section is, what does it mean to be a disciple, and more like Jesus? And that means generally a mix of being more perfect than you might be able to or want to, and dealing with things that you think might not be all that fair in the world, and also being very different from the world. So accepting some of the realities of unfairness, but also being different. I'm not sure if that fully explains it, but I think there is a context there. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question in terms of the fact that we're here studying now, and we hear you explaining things. But for someone maybe that's not, studying as deeply as we are, then the children don't have to pay. And it makes you think of young children, not necessarily children of God. So that could be, that could be confusing, just to have the children identified.
Right. Well, I think in this context, it links back pretty clearly to the children of the earthly kings.
Gotcha.
Right.
Okay. Mhm.
And so we have this in our own society, and I'm positive they had it in theirs, because this question comes up in theirs, that, the very, very wealthy people, oddly enough, are the ones collecting the taxes, not paying them. And in our society, all you have to do is open up the newspaper. I mean, Biden had a thing in the Journal the other day that mentioned, it was a bit of a straw man thing, but that's a different thing, but mentioned one of the plans of the tax plans, right, are always, these people are not paying a full tax, and these people, I think all of us have read about Amazon not paying, or Bezos not paying anywhere near as many percentage-wise as we might be. And he's not an earthly king, but the society is set up in a way that often makes it so that the children of the earthly kings are not paying what everybody else is. And so there is a critique in this, I think a pretty fair one, and also a pretty and honestly, this might be, I know people have read this as incredibly, this is similar to the unfairness aspect of the other one. I've worked my tail off all day, and then somebody else comes in later and gets the same amount as I do. There could be viewed an unfairness aspect to right here of well, so you don't offend them, just go along and do it, which could easily and has been linked into some of the stuff around your lot in life. The professors talked a little bit about wealthy slaves and poor slaves and that thing. But things like this, where it says just accept it the way it is, so you don't, offend them, and has been used for everything up to and including slavery, where people were told, oh, your lot in life is what it is. And people have critiqued this, I think fairly, that that's not what's going on here. This is a particular context over a question of the temple tax. So you have to kind of balance these things and not take them out of context. But Charlotte, your point, I think, is very valid in that often people are just reading this stuff and they pull something out and say, this is, and that can be very dangerous. And one of my hopes in this Bible study as we've moved forward is that you all are getting the full context, so that at least, if nothing else, when somebody pulls something out, you can say, well, there is a context to this. So, there's usually multiple layers of readings on it. And sometimes if you just pull a verse, which is terrible usually to do, or even if you pull a whole story or a whole chunk of teaching or a parable, sometimes you can get a kind of skewed perspective on it without looking at the overall context. All right, let's move along to 18. Yeah, it still doesn't preach well to get up and say, don't pay your taxes. Right? So for what that's worth. Okay, this is chapter 18. We're going to continue talking about the difference between what a disciple of Jesus is like and the world, and that enormous gap between the world, let's see if I can see my hands, the world and Jesus and his disciples are somewhere in this, right? They're not there, but they need to be less like the world and more like Jesus. And as we see, being like Jesus and that perfection is difficult to say the least. And they often are kind of reverting back to being more like the world. So Charlotte, can you read these two passages in 18?
Okay. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Then he called a little child over to sit among the disciples and said, "I assure you that if you don't turn your lives around and become like this little child, you will definitely not enter the kingdom of heaven. Those who humble themselves like this little child will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. As for whoever causes these little ones to believe in me to trip and fall into sin, it would be better for them to have a huge stone hung around their necks and be drowned in the bottom of the lake. How terrible it is for the world because of the things that cause people to trip and fall into sin. Such things have to happen, but how terrible it is for the person who causes those things to happen. If your hand or your foot causes you to fall into sin, chop it off and throw it away. It's better to enter into life crippled or lame than to be thrown into the eternal fire with 2 hands or 2 feet. If your eye causes you to fall into sin, tear it out and throw it away. It's better to enter into life with 1 eye than to be cast into a burning hell with 2 eyes.
Great. Okay. So I think it's important that this passage and section is directed to the disciples. There's a difference sometimes when Jesus is speaking to different groups. Sometimes he's speaking to just a small group of his disciples. Sometimes he's speaking just to the 12. Sometimes he's speaking to the disciples in general. And we know that that's a larger group than just the 12. And sometimes he's speaking to the crowds. And the professors said earlier that both of these are pretty good examples of likely hyperbole, in terms of you strive for the perfection, but you're not going to get there, but you strive for it nonetheless, level of, what it truly means to be a disciple. And so you get 2 examples of this contrasted. The question itself is problematic. Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven is an interesting question. And if you remember in some of the other gospel passages in Luke, the disciples are fighting about who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven at the Last Supper, ironically. And we've seen that before, that I think it's happened already in this gospel, that James and John ask to be at the right and at the left. And if we haven't seen it yet, we will see it. But the disciples seem to be very concerned about who's, it's like, okay, we can wrap our heads around that we have to separate from the world, but they take the same structures into the kingdom of heaven and want to be the greatest there. So the question itself is kind of problematic, right? And I don't think Jesus ever says you'll be the greatest. He flips it around and says you're not even going to get there if you're not like this child. And what does it mean to be like a child? The professors talked a little bit about that. But basically, you have to, presumably be pure like a child or humble like a child and that sort of thing. I mean, if you're that, you can get in and then you're the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. But he never actually says what that means. And then there's a flip. And I think this is really important. Remember, we were talking to the disciples. It suddenly turns, this and the next one is, it suddenly turns onto, if you're going to worry about yourself as my disciples, you have to also worry about the fact that you've been set up as leaders and people that are bringing people into the kingdom of heaven. And so, whoever welcomes one such child is equally important. And then we get into one of these about not just welcoming, but also if you are one of the people that causes somebody else to fall into sin and go back towards worldly things, you've got a big problem there, right? And I've been a Christian for my entire life, and I still have yet to have somebody quote this and say that this or the one about the eye is a literal interpretation, right? Not even the most fundamentalist people are going around talking about chopping their own hands off, right? Or pulling their own eyes. Usually they're interested in chopping somebody else's hand off, right? So this, I view this, and there's probably other ways of reading this. I view this as a mix of, you really do have to be perfect. It's unattainable, but you continue to strive for that. And on top of that, you also can't lead anybody astray by saying things like, it doesn't matter, you don't have, that sort of thing. And so there's a high bar, not just, and this is St. Matthew's gospel, but there's a very high bar for what it means to be a disciple, and an even higher bar for what it means to be a disciple who's playing the role, which we'll get in a second, of a shepherd in some way, right? People like me, obviously, but any leader in the church, anybody who's so bold as to try to spread the good news of Jesus, which is all of our calling. So it's a double whammy, if that makes sense, for those who are disciples. And part of being a disciple is also bringing other people in and doing that sort of thing. So I hope that makes sense. All right, let's move along to Alban. Can you read the parable of the lost sheep? And sinning against brother and sister. We'll do two at once so that
Okay. Be careful that you don't look down on one of these little ones. I say to you that their angels in heaven are always looking into the face of my Father who is in heaven. What do you think? If someone had 100 sheep and one of them wandered off, would he leave the 99 on the hillsides and go in search for the one that wandered off? If he finds it, I assure you that he is happier about having that one sheep about having one sheep than about the 99 who didn't wander off. In the same way, my Father who is in heaven doesn't want to lose one of these little ones. If your brother or sister sins against you, go and correct them when you are alone together. If they listen to you, then you've won over your brother or sister. But if they won't listen, take with you one or two others, so that every word may be established by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. But if they still won't pay attention, report it to the church. If they won't pay attention even to the church, treat them as you would a Gentile and tax collector. I assure you that whatever you fasten on earth will be fastened in heaven. And whatever you loosen on earth will be loosened in heaven. Again, I assure you that if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you ask, then my Father who is in heaven will do it for you. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm there with them.
Great. Okay. So I think the transition is fairly clear that God, as the good shepherd, which we aren't given that exact thing, but this image appears in a variety of places, and as the professors noted, among other places, it comes from Ezekiel 34, obviously Psalm 22, right? The Lord is my shepherd, that sort of thing. But God is like a sheep herder who would, if there was 100 sheep and one wandered off, would absolutely make sure that the 99th, the 100th rather, is found. I'm not a shepherd. I don't know if this is factually true. I assume it is. I've never heard any critique otherwise, that people are happy to lose sheep if they're shepherds. And so God is like that. God doesn't want to lose any of the sheep. So it's kind of, again, it's a 2-part thing. On the one hand, part of the impetus for people not sinning is that God doesn't want to lose them. So again, what does it mean for his disciples? Well, they're not called to lead people into sin. They must themselves do everything they can not to sin, because God doesn't want to lose them. And then we get in this other thing about sinning against brother or sister, which is, well, what do we do in the case of somebody who has sinned? And as our professors noted, in St. Matthew's time, it probably was the same as in all of Christian history, that people in churches argue with each other, and there's fractions and disagreements. And so how do you address that and make sure that somebody who may be doing something they shouldn't be doing, what do you do with that person? And what is the logical, worldly way of doing it? You throw them out, right? But Jesus says, no, you don't throw them out. You actually go and you speak with them, and you work with them, and that sort of thing, and keep going and continue to try. And eventually, this is interesting. Eventually, you do get to the point where if they refuse and refuse and refuse and refuse, then yes, you will have to let them go, which does stand in contrast to what we're going to hear immediately afterwards. Well, how long does it take, right? We're going to read this in a second. How many times should I forgive this person? And Jesus says, 70 times 7, right? We'll get that in a second. And so the obvious question is how long do we have to be in this loop of forgiveness, right? And Peter's like, 7 seems reasonable, right? 7 seems long. And then Jesus says, right, it's going to be a lot longer than that. So getting to this point, and again, this is a great example of something that's taken often out of context, where, well, we did what we could. We went and talked to the person, and then they didn't listen to us. So we took 1 or 2 others, and we had multiple witnesses, and they didn't listen to us. And then we reported to the church, and they didn't listen to the church. So we threw them out. A couple of verses later, it says, well, how long does this loop exist? And the answer is, you keep trying and keep trying and keep trying. So I'm not sure you ever really get to this point. And if you can, it's because it's so, if you ever do, it's because it's basically so intractable that the person is just never going to to come back in. Another part of this usually is associated with St. Peter, right? This line about whatever you loose on earth is loosened in heaven. And it's important to note that in Matthew's gospel, this is directed at all of the disciples. So this is a larger church thing in St. Matthew's gospel. And one could argue that Matthew may be aware of the other tradition where it's directed specifically at St. Peter. Certainly earlier he said Peter was the rock, but if you remember there, immediately after that, Peter was also, called Satan. And immediately after this, loosed on earth, loosed in heaven, Peter asks a kind of an obvious but kind of a dumb question, right? So Peter is sort of almost a foil in this little section. I hope that makes sense. And then we have the famous line that we've heard plenty of times, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm there in the midst of them, which, again, if you're trying to come up with a logic of a full church, there's a lot of stuff in tension, right? This could easily be used as, look, if we can't come to an agreement, then we'll just separate off, right? We'll just have our own. I've heard before, this is a great defense of denominations, right? Because there's always 2 or 3, right? But this, again, if you pull that out of context, you could get to that. But in the context, you're not really ever supposed to separate off from the other disciples. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, let's,
Yeah. Peter's question may seem silly, but it enlightens all of us because he's thinking seven times is a lot, but Jesus says 70 times 7, which is infinitely larger.
I think his question is entirely reasonable. I wouldn't say it's silly. I'd say it's very reasonable, because I love it. As my favorite part, as many as 7 times. It's like, at what point does this, and if you've ever gotten into an argument with anybody, especially in the church, it's like, look, I've tried 3 or 4 times. And if you get to the point where it's 7, I mean, pardon the pun, like, good Lord, like, we've done enough, right? and no, keep trying. Again, this is in the context of, you're going to try to strive to be like me on the mountain, and you're not ever going to get there, but you got to keep going up, because otherwise you're just like the world. And so there really is this major difference, and we are in that middle. We don't want to be down in the world, but we also are never really going to get to the top of the mountain, but we keep striving. That, I think, is the message of all of this. So let's read this parable. Who's up? JD, are you up? I think you are.
Yes, I'm up.
All right.
So where am I starting?
The top. Then Peter said to Jesus.
Yeah. Then Peter said to Jesus, Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Should I forgive as many as 7 times? Jesus said, not just 7 times, but rather as many as 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle accounts, they brought to him a servant who owed him 10,000 bags of gold. Because the servant didn't have enough to pay it back, the master ordered that he should be sold, along with his wife and children and everything he had, and that the proceeds should be used as payment. But the servant fell down, kneeled before him, and said, please be patient with me, and I'll pay you back. The master had compassion on the servant and released him and forgave the loan. When that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 coins. He grabbed him around the throat and said, pay me back what you owe me. Then his fellow servant fell down and begged him, be patient with me and I'll pay you back. I'll pay you back 30, but he refused. Instead, he threw him into prison until he paid back his debt. When his fellow servants saw what happened, they were deeply offended. They came and told their master all that had happened. His master, I'm sorry.
I
thought you said something.
Yeah, I coughed.
His master called the first servant and said, you wicked servant, I forgave all that debt because you appealed to me. Shouldn't you also have mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had mercy on you? His master was furious and handed him over to the guard responsible for punishing prisoners until he had paid the whole debt. My heavenly Father will also do the same to you if you don't forgive your brother and sister from your heart.
Great. Okay, this is classic Saint Matthew. In the you need to strive to this perfection because God has been merciful to you, and if you are not, big problems are going to happen to you. Right? Like we don't get that in the same way in some of the other Gospels. Less, you get some of it in Luke, less so in John, but it's there in all of them. That and again, this is in the context of a parable. Often, is God going to throw us into a prison if we are sinners? That looks very much like hell and purgatory in some renderings of them. And so people tend to run with this sometimes. And why do they do that? Well, sometimes they're trying to scare people. Sometimes they are trying to scare themselves and that sort of thing. But the image there is definitely that God does not want disciples of Christ are called, as I've said again and again, to be Christ-like and aim for that true level of discipleship that may be unattainable, but is something we are called to strive to do for. And if you don't do it, it's not just, there is such a circular thing here. If you don't do it, there's a huge problem. However, one can argue if you don't do it, you're still, the church is still called to forgive, right? Again and again and again. So that loop is on. But I think that what I take as a priest, at least, is that there is a significant responsibility to being a Christian, and even more so to taking on Christian leadership, in that, you can't steer people the wrong way. You can't you can't do one thing for yourself and then a different thing for other people. And in terms of forgiveness, you are called to forgive in every possible thing. This is so sad, this parable, because it's so obviously something that gets lived out pretty regularly, right? Where people, something nice happens to you, somebody does something for you, and then you turn around and throttle somebody else for a minor thing. So, and it doesn't have to just be money. It can be basically for anything. So any comments on this? The professors dealt with the thousands of bags of gold versus the 100 coins, that slavery at that time was a different, it wasn't just chattel slavery and people rowing galleons. It was also people that managed enormous estates. And Professor Attridge referenced this, but it is worth knowing or recalling that if you were a slave in a very wealthy household or a slave in the government and high up, you actually had more power than your average everyday citizen. So it's a very different image of slavery than what we have. That doesn't mean you weren't a slave, right? Realistically, you could still be sold if you and your fortunes literally could turn overnight if you did something wrong. But it is a different, it's worth remembering that it's a different type of thing when we think of whether this is realistic or not. And I think the answer is it is realistic back then, and it's realistic in a different way now. So any comments on this section? All right, our time is up. The next chapter is 19. I'll give you a preview. It's the same stuff about striving for perfection. It starts with divorce and then blessing the children, and then the rich man's question of how much do I have to give away and all this other stuff, and then teaching about giving up things. And then chapter 20, which the goal for next week is 19 and 20, is the parable of the vineyard and the workers, which they mentioned. And then the final passion prediction And then we'll get to it. But then I had referenced it. James and John asked to be sitting at the, right and the left in the kingdom of heaven. So even after all of this, the disciples still don't quite get it. So we'll read through this. But have a great week. Men, don't forget the pig roast is tomorrow. Charlotte, remind Jim of that because I believe he's coming.
Yes, he is. Does anybody know a notary? Do you know a notary in the area? Notary Public?
Usually the bank has one.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, or one of the passport shops often will have one too.
Oh, right.
Things
Okay,
like that.
yes, thank you.
And I think they'll charge you like $20 or something.
Okay,
I was a notary once, and it was you're not allowed to charge for your services other than the inconvenience aspect. So there's like some level of the
got you. Yes,
It's
yes,
like,
yes, yes.
yeah, you can't set up shop and charge as a notary for and make buckets and buckets of money. But
I was one once and I was only allowed to charge $2.
yeah, that it may only be $2. It's not. Yeah,
Yeah.
It's probably. I was a notary 20 years ago.
That was when I was too. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was. I remember when I got the license, I was like, really? That's too bad. I thought I could do something more with this.
Right.
I was also a process server, and you can make some decent money doing that. There's a great. I'll leave you with this. There used to be a great ad in one of the law journals in the city. Maybe it was the law journal, and it was for a process server, and the ad was like a drawing of a guy scaling down a building with a rope with like legal papers in his mouth. Those are interesting times and interesting stories, but some other day we will talk about process service.
All right.
God bless. Have a great
Thank you.
week. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.